Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the final iteration of Lunchtime Looks for the fall 2025 semester. We will pick back up our Lunchtime Looks programming with our new exhibitions in the spring. But before that, we are very honored to have today Dr. María Pérez, who is an associate professor in the Department of Geography. She is a cultural anthropologist by training, and looking at the historic and cultural context of scientific practice, particularly as it relates to speleology, which is the study of the science and exploration of caves. So we are going to tie that all together with the exhibition we're sitting in today, Gamaliel Rodriguez, Topographies of Memory. And I'm excited to hear what Dr. Pérez has to say, and as many of you who are regulars at this event know, that the ethos of this program is to make connections across our campus and broader Morgantown community with interdisciplinary experts, scholars, and practitioners who have distinct and unique lenses through which to view our exhibitions. And I'm particularly excited to hear Dr. Pérez's lens now. Thank you very much, and welcome, Dr. Pérez.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Virginia, the rest of the WVU Art Museum staff, friends of the museum who are here. Thank you, George and Tia and Charlotte and Roger, for being here. Also, thank you to my husband who's here, who's seen me worry on this talk from weeks on end. Finally, the day, I'm so excited, and friends. And actually a special shout out to Jace, who is a student of mine in my sustainability class, global sustainability. I actually had my students listen to my talk this morning because I said, guys, I have to practice. And I guess it wasn't all that bad. He was willing to come here and watch it again. So I really appreciate you being here, Jace, and also on behalf of all of my students, thank you. Okay. So the title of my talk is Karstographies of Life. It's obviously a spin-off of the title of Gamaliel's exhibit, which is Topographies of Memory. I had an opportunity to meet Gamaliel a couple of months ago. Thank you, Leah, for contacting me. She said, you gotta get to the museum right now. And when Leah says, do something, I do it. Because thanks to Leah, I have funding to travel to Puerto Rico. So yes, thank you, Leah, for thinking of me. That was really, truly special. I want to clarify that I'm not Puerto Rican, although you will see that my accent is going to start to come out. I was born and raised nearby in Venezuela, but I've been lucky to travel to Puerto Rico pretty frequently since 2019. That work eventually led to the start of a National Science Foundation funded project studying the human dimensions of cave, karst, exploration, and conservation. So yes, my PhD is in cultural anthropology, so a lot of the research I do actually responds or asks broader humanistic questions, farther, even beyond caves and karst, right? So questions like, what brings us together? How do places become meaningful? Why is it that we come to love some places more than others? Why is it that cavers like to crawl in dark, muddy places? It's a very weird situation, but they do exist. We're very strange creatures, but we do exist. And also, how do we come to value places beyond dollars and cents? That's important. In fact, the topic we talk a lot about in our classes on global sustainability as well. And also, who has the power to represent and make visible the hidden dimensions of the landscape, something that Gamaliel does masterfully. Right? So those questions really inspire me. They were on my mind when I saw Gamaliel's exhibit, and I will share some of my answers to those questions today as they relate to his work, my work, and your presence here today. So I have some handouts, and we'll do our best going through them. I'm going to ask you to turn to page 2, where you're going to see a map of the karst of Puerto Rico. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you know what caves are. but perhaps the term karst is less familiar. So I will define it for you so you know a little bit of the reason for me to bring it up in this context. So karst landscapes contain caves, sinkholes, and other surface and subsurface features shaped by mildly acidic water's capacity to dissolve stone, usually limestone and other carbonate rock. And I actually brought a show and tell piece. A dear friend of mine from Puerto Rico, Jose Colon, whose organization that he's part of, I'm going to mention, picked up this piece of limestone in his land, and he polished it and placed it in this beautiful little base of wood. So I'm going to pass it around. So you're welcome to ignore me and just like connect with the karst of Puerto Rico. You have my permission. So it's going to be going around. So about 25% of the Earth's terrain is karst. In Puerto Rico, that's a little higher. About a third of Puerto Rico's terrain of the entire archipelago is karst. And karst is super important to conserve and value. Not only does it have geologic, biological, ecological, and historic value, it also is home to a lot of freshwater aquifers. And in a place like Puerto Rico, where access to fresh water is so important, it is especially important to conserve the karst of Puerto Rico. Again, not only its surface features, but also the features above ground, okay? So the map before you shows you the distribution of karst in Puerto Rico. There's the massive northern karst belt, and then there's some dispersed karst in the southwestern and southern part of Puerto Rico. I'm going to be mentioning some of that today. Specifically, I'm going to give you a tour of some key sites where Gamaliel's work intersects with karst and also my own interest in my research, okay? So we're going to do 4 stops. We're going to start at the top western, eastern part of the main island of Puerto Rico. We're going to stop in Arecibo. Then we're going to head down to Rincon. And we're going to end in southwestern Puerto Rico in the municipality of Cabo Rojo, which is actually where Gamaliel lives. So this painting and also the one with this lighthouse on the side, I'm going to assume that is the lighthouse that is actually located in his neighborhood. So we will end in the place that Gamaliel calls home. All right, we're going to go to the next page, page 3. In this page, I have a collage to give you a sense of the diversity of karst landscapes, okay? On the top, you actually have an aerial view. Actually, coincidentally, the photo was taken by Jose Colon, who is the gentleman who gifted me that pretty stone that is walking around. So these crazy connections, okay? So that is the beautiful cockpit karst of the northern karst belt of Puerto Rico. It's got caves, it's got sinkholes. And in the bottom images, some textures of karst, some southern coastal karst features, and also, of course, caves. Now, why am I talking about karst in this exhibit? So this gets me to this really important point. When you see a lot of Gamaliel's artwork, there's these massive structures, geometric, you know, modern, okay? And the first thing I think of is concrete. A lot of concrete, a lot of cement. And when I think of concrete and cement, I think of quarries. And in Puerto Rico, quarries are in karst areas because the quarries need to crush limestone to produce the cement ceilings and the things that go into concrete that then are necessary to build infrastructure in this place and also anywhere in the world that uses concrete. And of course, we understand the need to build infrastructure and to use the resources available to the community. But we always have to ask, you know, is this destruction and construction done thoughtfully, weighing costs and benefits? Importantly, is the investment in this infrastructure cared for so that the investment is actually worth the while, especially if it came with a significant environmental impact, which is actually the case in Puerto Rico. So let's consider some of these additional questions as I start our tour. So let's go to the next page. We're now on page 4 of your handout. And I have a couple of really just different contrasting images taken from Old San Juan. Now, who has been to Old San Juan? Okay, a few of you. One great reason, there's many, but one of the good reasons to visit Old San Juan is that it is a very historic city. It's got buildings as old, going back to the 1500s, and it was a really important military post for the Spanish Empire. And they built these large military fortresses. So the image on the left is actually from El Morro, a very famous structure. And the one on the right is actually a detail that is located in San Felipe, in the San Felipe fortress, right next to El Morro. Now, the design of that concrete structure is very different from the historic design of the one on the left. And part of my point to have those two images together is to show kind of like the different layers of history that characterize many places of Puerto Rico, both of which connect to karst. How? In two main ways. One of it is one that few tourists know about, and that is Old San Juan was actually built on a series of petrified dunes. And these dunes that were actually formed by layers of sand that flew from the Sahara over the Atlantic and then deposited in the northern coast of Puerto Rico, eventually petrified. But that stuff is carbonate rock, and it actually forms caves beneath when the fresh water lens actually, bubbles up, and then you also have the erosion from the sea. You actually have caves underneath El Morro, and during efforts to try to preserve the historic infrastructure, they've had to call in cavers. Like, guys, we got these caves, what do we do with them, right? Because this thing couldn't collapse. So that's one connection. And the other one, of course, is that there were quarries where limestone had to be dug up, cut out to be able to build these infrastructures. So again, already in Old San Juan, even outside of the northern karst belt, you see these layered uses, historic uses of concrete that impacts the conservation of karst in the island. Okay? So I'm going to move on to the next stop. I'm not going to linger in San Juan. I'm going to take you to Arecibo now. So we're going to be basically getting on the highway, getting through the tapón. There's a lot of traffic usually if you hit, rush hour, you're heading out. And then eventually you hit the municipality of Arecibo, which is right at the heart of the northern karst belt of Puerto Rico. So the image before you is actually, the photo on the left is a photo I took in 2023 after the really devastating collapse of the tools that are used that were central to the Arecibo radio telescope, okay? Now, why is this connected to karst? And of course, why is it connected to Gamaliel's story? In great part, the Arecibo radio telescope is an example of these massive, modern, sophisticated infrastructures that were placed in Puerto Rico. So what was happening, right? I'm going to take you back to the 1950s. The tensions of the Cold War are increasing, and the U.S. Department of Defense needs a really good radar to be able to locate missiles in the ionosphere. So the idea came up of building a radar that could do exactly that. And they needed this radar to be near the equator. It also had to be within the U.S. territory, and of course, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. And third, because the design involved a massive dish, 1,000 feet wide, they needed a hole big enough to put the dish in. And it turns out that in this last point, the karst of Puerto Rico naturally provided a big sinkhole. A sinkhole that actually reduced the labor and cost of having to dig a hole big enough to locate and place this large dish, okay? So in fact, in your images, you can see the cone karst in the background. And few people know this, but there's actually a cave in the bottom of the dish. In fact, after the collapse of the dish, there was a concern of whether or not there were toxic chemicals that could actually enter the karst systems, because I mean, this is like Swiss cheese. There's holes in the ground. That's part of the quality of the karst terrain. So the project was initially for the Department of Defense, but then it became, was dedicated to civilian use for science, okay? And in fact, some of our own WVU physicists actually worked in this Arecibo radio telescope. It is a scientific, it was for a long time a very important site of astronomic and physics research. And in fact, it has some connections with the Greenbank Observatory right here in West Virginia. Unfortunately, the investment in science and education that for a long time maintained the site active in Puerto Rico was no longer valued. In fact, in the words of some Puerto Ricans, they use stronger words. It was actually a form of abandonment, right? Kind of like raising in our minds this concern that Gamaliel presents in his art. It's like you build these structures, but then what happens if you don't take care of them? What are their purpose in the middle of the tropical forests of Puerto Rico? So tragically, on December 1st, 2020, the support cables holding the instrument on top of the sphere eventually snapped, and one of the massive concrete towers actually collapsed onto the dish, you know, again, resulting in this gash that you see, a picture that I myself took in November of 2023. All right? So that's our first stop. We're not leaving Arecibo, however, because I wanted to impress upon you on your next page, on slide 6, this is actually a photo of another sinkhole, very close to the sinkhole containing the Arecibo radio telescope remains. But this sinkhole is different in that the science that happens here with archaeologists, biologists, ecologists are actually based on trying to understand karst ecosystems. This is actually a photo in the bottom of this sinkhole, and it is part of a natural preserve called El Tallonal, which is actually being managed and taken care of by volunteers, part of Ciudadanos del Carso, or Citizens of Karst, a 30-year-old NGO with whom I've been working closely. And in fact, I have a memorable moment. This is a funny coincidence with Gamaliel. I was talking to Gamaliel, and I was like, yeah, I'm into caves. And he's like, oh, I have a really good friend that loves bats. And I'm like, don't tell me, I know his name. That's Angelo Soto Centeno. He's like, yes, I'm him. He's like, wow, he's a doctor now? Yeah, he's a doctor, man. He's a doctor. And actually, I was with Angelo Soto Centeno and his students in this sinkhole right here in this photo, and I was able to see how his students were using nifty devices right on their cell phone to identify the bats flying in the night sky of the northern karst belt. So here it is, another kind of science, perhaps not the sophisticated and high technology science of the Arecibo radio telescope, but science and community nevertheless happening right next door in the northern karst belt. One last stop in Arecibo, and then we'll move along. So slide 7. Here you see a collage of 3 images. The top image is the facade of the future home of the Instituto del Carso de Puerto Rico y el Caribe, okay? An institute dedicated to the study and education and conservation of karst. So another reason why I love to show this case to you is that here you have an abandoned school, their school that was abandoned, and then a community group trying to save the historic value of this building. Yes, plenty of concrete here, but instead of demolishing it, let's return its use in the community to education, to science. And listen, if you've got a lot of money, these people need money to finish this important project, so you can look them up on the web, and you have a big green donate here button, donate, and be like, Maria told me so, and I'll get some kudos for that, and you'll help my research along. All right, and with that, we're moving on to slide 8, to another site in our tour. This is site number 3. And now, we kept going, driving along the coast of Puerto Rico, and then now we're like down to the corner there on the western tippy end, in the town of Rincon, in Rincon. So the image on the top left is actually an image of some of the rocky features of this beautiful beach town. It's actually a famous surf town. A lot of surfers live and visit Rincon. Live in Rincon, and I just couldn't resist. I mean, I saw Gamaliel's image, one of his art pieces, right? The figure 1736, I reproduced it there for you. You'll be able to see it in the gallery as you walk out. It's a figure that for me is impossible not to associate with a real place in Rincon. And that real place is the Boiling Nuclear Superheater Reactor Facility, or BONUS, a prototype nuclear power plant built in 1960 as a way to try to use nuclear energy to produce electricity. And actually, the image in the bottom left is a photo I took, and I'm like stuck there. I'm like, please let me in, please let me in. Like, no. There used to be this little museum there, and now it's not maintained, so it's closed to the public, which I really regret, because I mean, I really like to learn about the history of science. But the point, of course, is again an example of investment in major infrastructure in Puerto Rico, right? But unfortunately, another example of an investment that is either abandoned or decommissioned, and yet there it is as part of the Puerto Rican landscape, right? So it actually achieved full operation in 1965. Then it was decommissioned because of rising costs and technical difficulties, and you guessed it, a lot of concrete had to be used to store the radioactive waste that was used to run this facility, okay? Concrete that, yes, you guessed it, impacts the karst of Puerto Rico. Now, there's an unintended like silver lining story in the case of BONUS, or Los Domos, as it is known in this part of Puerto Rico. And that is that all around it, there are green areas. So I see Gamaliel's photo, his painting, his drawings, actually, because mostly he does a lot of drawings with color pencils and pens even. And then, imagine this BONUS in the middle of Rincon in this green area right around it, and it was part of the buffer of the nuclear reactor. And of course, the good thing about that is that it's preserved as a green area, and local activists have been able to build natural trails, walking trails, biking trails, so people can actually enjoy, the landscape. Which takes me to page 9. Also in Rincon, there is an ongoing battle that the local activists are engaged in. This image that you see that I took in June of this year features Cristina Canals, who's actually a champion surfer, and then a prominent environmental activist who lives with her family in Rincon. And the woman in sitting down, Dr. Raiza Quintero, is actually a Puerto Rican geologist. And on that day, when I was visiting Rincon, in fact, I was with my family, my husband is here, and our 3 kids, Raiza and Cristina Canals were doing a talk to the grad students and saying, guys, you have to understand the geology, the ecology of the coast, and they were trying to raise awareness because there's currently a state-sponsored project to build a massive concrete structure right on the coast for bikes. And the community is like, don't do that. You put a bunch of concrete right on the coast, right on what we call the littoral margin, and it usually doesn't end well because the sea takes it back into the sea. So they're doing what they can to raise awareness, to suggest they're all for bike trails, but can we do it in a way that actually respects the natural ecosystem, and importantly, for those of us who love karst, respect the coastal karst of Rincon. All right? So on to our 4th and last stop of our tour. And actually, this stop is the reason why I am right here in front of this painting by Gamaliel. called Natural Power at My Front Yard. And you know me, I'm seeing this and my eyes go to the mountains in the background. I'm like, Gamaliel, this is in Cabo Rojo. This is Sierra Bermeja. He's like, yeah, this is where I live. I said, oh, this is amazing because it turns out there's caves there. And he's like, all right, yeah. So actually, in this second to last slide, the picture on the top is a panoramic view of Boquerón Bay, which is a beautiful bay that is at the heart of the Cabo Rojo municipality. And on the right side of that, it looks nice and flat, but in fact, on the right side is a green reserve called Punta Guaniquilla that has the oldest karst of Puerto Rico. And it also has a stunning series of caves, one of which is Cofresí Cave, and the image on the bottom right has my beautiful daughter, Carmen Elena, who I'm training. I'm training all my kids to go caving. I was like, you want pinchos, you gotta go caving. So pinchos are the name for the Puerto Rican barbecue. So you want barbecue, you need to go caving with mommy in Puerto Rico. So there is Carmen caving in Cueva Cofresí, a cave that is not only geologically significant, but also historically significant because a famous pirate, Cofresí, hid the ashes of a family member in there. And you can still visit this cave. It's open to the public. In many ways, these caves kind of protect themselves because, they're dark and they can be dangerous. But anyway, in this seemingly flat Boquerón Bay, there's these hidden voluminous features, right, hidden in the landscape that connect to the karst systems of Puerto Rico. And on the left side, which is closer to the image of where Gamaliel's home is actually a series of hills known as Peñones de Melones. This is a place where the image on the bottom left was taken. I did not take that photo. My dear friend Miguel Martinez, who is an active caver of southern Puerto Rico, actually took this photo. This cave is actually located in Peñones de Melones. I have yet to visit it. I very much would like to visit. There's cave art, there's rock art there. In fact, there's a lot of archaeologic material in this region. And one of the things that is really concerning a lot of community activists is that there's currently a massive luxury tourist project that is slated to be built in this part of the southern part of Boquerón Bay. A lot of activists and even a lot of government experts who have evaluated the environmental impact of this project are saying this is not a good idea. And not only that, there's this karst, there's these caves, and it's also a project that would have a water demand that would truly exceed the community's capacity to make available fresh water it's already struggling to keep up with water demand in Puerto Rico, in this part of Puerto Rico, imagine more. So I take this moment to publicly state my support in terms of advocacy with the community activists that are saying no to the project Esencia because it would truly have negative environmental impacts in this region. And that takes us to our last slide. Our last slide is actually, I'll start with actually the image in the bottom, which is a panoramic view. And yes, you guessed it, that's a bunch of coastal karst in Cabo Rojo. And, there is a lighthouse in the center of that panoramic image. And I didn't ask Gamaliel, but I have to believe that painting in the center of the gallery that you can take a look at as you're walking out is probably making reference to the Faro Los Morillos, built in 1882 in this important part of southwestern Puerto Rico. And then, from that plateau, I actually look northward, and then you see the beautiful image at the top of this last slide. And with it, I'm just gonna end by reminding us of how both Gamaliel and the karst of Puerto Rico asks us, right, to pay attention to the complexity and three-dimensionality of Puerto Rico's, not only its landscape, but also its history. I thank Gamaliel and his work for inspiring this tour, this opportunity to share what I have learned of a place that I have come to truly love, truly love. I hope to join me in valuing it and protecting it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much to Dr. Peréz. And I do owe you an apology because when I previewed your talk during Dr. Renfrew's talk, I mistakenly identified you as being Puerto Rican, but the love that you have for Puerto Rico and the scientific knowledge.
No, you know, I didn't even notice. I didn't even notice.
I do have to apologize for that and correct myself. But one of the great privileges of this job is getting to learn new things and make new connections, and all of this was new for me, and I'm so grateful to you for sharing your knowledge and the connections between your work and Gamaliel's work, and we're so grateful to you. We have some time for some questions because we are recording. We ask that any questions are spoken into the microphone.
Hi, I'm Tia. I have a question about the rock that the karst that you sent around. That limestone is very pink. Is all of the karst there pink like that, or why is?
No,
I think of limestone as white.
Yeah, so it varies in hues, and you know, the geologic composition of karst actually varies in different parts of Puerto Rico. I'm pretty sure that that rock was actually from the northern karst belt, which is part of a limestone formation that has that color. But in other parts of Puerto Rico, it does take different hues. I do have to say, you know, people say, oh, she's talking about karst and caves, and people usually think I'm a geologist. I'm not a geologist. So don't ask any complicated geology questions because I will look bad on video. But I have seen enough karst in Puerto Rico to appreciate its diversity in terms of its texture, also its solidity, how solid it is. In some places it's much more crumbly, in other parts it's much more solid. It's been so cool to visit places that have extraordinary fossils, right in the limestone, right in the karst, something that you see both in the caves and also within the broader superficial landscape features of Puerto Rico. Awesome, Tia, thank you.
Other questions?
I think there's one over there.
Sorry.
Is there karst that is more valuable in certain regions than other regions, or is it just a mineral that purely exists in Puerto Rico and needs to be preserved?
That's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer. First, I should note, this is interesting with karst. So karst itself is not a kind of mineral. In fact, karst is more of like a kind of landscape that is produced by a certain kind of process. So this is why it typically happens in limestone, but it can happen in other kinds of rock, other carbonate rock. And fascinating to note, in fact, in my country of Venezuela, we have some of the oldest rock in the world, right? With these old sandstone where Angel Falls is located. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Up, the Disney movie Up. All right, so that's actually a real place. You know, we have the Roraima Formation, where you actually also have karst features, but in this case produced in sandstone, which is not typically associated with karst processes. This is all to say that we see examples of karst processes in different kinds of stone. I'm sure that, you know, geologists might argue about which is more or less valuable to preserve. I'm sure that most of us would say all of it, understanding, of course, that, you know, some impact on the environment is sometimes inevitable. But I will say this. There are many sites in Puerto Rico, two things. I mentioned the importance of karst aquifers, right? So protecting karst features that have direct access to the freshwater aquifers of Puerto Rico are especially important to protect, because if contaminants reach these openings in the landscape, they contaminate the entire aquifer, okay? So from that perspective, in terms of the value of freshwater ecosystems and in the karst aquifer, from that utilitarian point of view, it would be very important to preserve, number one. The other one is the cultural and historical value of some of these karst places in Puerto Rico is really like top of the line. I've never visited this place, but there's an island called Isla de Mona Island, which is an entire karst uplifted island. Okay, it's all karst. And it's in the middle, it's in the Mona Passage. It's between the main island of Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. And actually, this place, which is known as the Galapagos of the Caribbean, is very important ecologically, geologically, and critically culturally, because it was a place where indigenous communities settled. There's a lot of really important rock art there that tells remarkable stories about not only of the settling and the populations of the Caribbean before the arrival of the Europeans, but there's also really significant artwork, rock art rather, and other kinds of indigenous artwork that tells remarkable stories of the moment of contact. So from the perspective of archaeology and cultural significance, I can certainly vouch for the importance of Isla de Mona to be preserved. And in fact, it is preserved. But as archaeologists will say in the main island, there are plenty of places with, equally significant importance in the main island. So, and I will say, Puerto Rico, thanks to the work of Ciudadanos El Carso, Puerto Rico was actually one of the first places in the Americas to have specific laws to protect the geologic, ecological, and cultural value of karst. So there is a legal framework. Unfortunately, it is constantly trying to be weakened by people who are more interested in development projects that care not about the environmental impact of their projects. But there is a legal framework in Puerto Rico to preserve the karst, and they have certain criteria that they use to value it and preserve it.
I'm curious just to ask you a little bit more about how preparing this talk and talking with Gamaliel maybe makes you think about the roles of science and art in communicating these messages. Because one of the things that Gamaliel has said to us, and when he talks about his work, is some of these landscapes are purposefully imagined and not real, and he uses artistic devices and creation to convey some of these things, and science conveys meaning and messages in different ways. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your understanding of those intersections and the power of both of those forms to communicate about this kind of knowledge.
Wow, that's a huge question. Let me think about how I might answer it. A million things come to mind.
I'm sorry.
No, this is good. This is good. I just have to focus on one. Okay, I'm going to give you well, first the obvious for me at least. Artists are, the power of art, of course, is to convey, to have a stop and ponder. Not necessarily communicate a message, but have a stop and ponder, right? Some of the fundamental humanistic questions, not only of our time, but of the past, right? So just understood broadly. One of the topics that I was thinking of bringing here is how the processes by which the artist renders the image, and also how, from my experiences, the caver or the karst scientist renders visible the three-dimensionality of the caves and karst of Puerto Rico. There's a really interesting connection there, that actually asks us to ponder the question of process. What is the process by which scientific knowledge is actually produced? What is the process by which art is actually produced? And when we actually focus on practice, on process, sometimes the distinction between art and science gets muddled, right? I was really captivated by some videos I saw on YouTube of Gamaliel working with his pen. I mean, some of these images are really labor intensive with the pen. And I'm like, God, why are you just, dude, what are you doing there, right? This is kind of really, really intense, right? But there's something about seeing this human with the pen and the intensity of the body in trying to render these extraordinary images made me think of the process of cave mapping and cave surveying. So every time I disappear to Puerto Rico and my husband is left alone with my 3 kids, most of the day in Puerto Rico I spend in the field, you know, in the karst, the caves, the karst. And when we survey cave features and karst features, we actually use pencil. And we have paper, not unlike the artist, okay? And it is also a process that requires our bodies to conform in ways that give themselves to the process, whether it is in the sake of science or in the sake of an artistic, in the sake of art. And I kind of love that. I kind of love to think about like how through pen, pencil, colors, and paper, we're able to bring to life, even if it's something that is two-dimensional, how we're able to bring to life something that is three-dimensional, complex, and with historical and spatial depth and complexity. So, how's that?
I think that's beautiful.
Okay, so I had to bring that in.
No, I think
yeah,
it is really beautiful.
And in fact, my first peer review paper was on cave mapping, the social dimensions of cave mapping, and I become kind of obsessed with this idea of lines on paper, but also the traces that human bodies leave in the landscapes that we are exploring. So I have to say it's something, at least from that vantage point, I see a really fascinating connection between art and science.
I know, I think that's really beautiful. George?
As you were answering that question, I was thinking to myself, I kind of feel like science is a process that seeks to answer a question. Art is a process that poses the question.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, George said that. Very good, very good, very good. Yes, what he said. Yes. Awesome.
Well, and
awesome.
I do think
awesome.
that is,
awesome.
you know, a really
awesome.
lovely way to actually wrap up the talk,
awesome.
unless anyone
awesome.
has further questions. And like I said, I also think, and it's part of the reason I posed the question, and I appreciate your answer, and I appreciate your reflection, George, is it really is the spirit of this program to talk about the ways that we can find connections and that art can inspire conversation around many different fields of scholarship. So I'm really grateful to have learned from you today, Dr. Perez.
Thank you so much.